When the first gush of water blasted through my driveway like a broken fire hydrant, I wasn't surprised. It was almost inevitable. Karen had been out there with her cordless drill for nearly an hour, muttering about illegal pipes stealing HOA resources, and waving a clipboard she claimed gave her exclusive authority. I had warned her twice from my porch, calmly, sarcastically, even offering her lemonade just to see if she'd pause long enough to realize how insane she looked. But Karen doesn't pause. She doubles down. And so when the bit of her drill punched straight through the main water line feeding my property, the eruption looked like a Vegas fountain choreographed by stupidity. The irony was so thick I could have bottled it. She stumbled back, shrieking, her yoga pants soaked to the skin, mascara streaking like war paint. My driveway was instantly a river, neighbors leaning out of windows to watch the HOA's most self-righteous warrior defeat herself in spectacular fashion. And all I could think was, finally, I don't have to explain anymore. Karen just made my case louder than I ever could. But of course, the water didn't stop with humiliation. It rushed downhill toward her own freshly landscaped front yard. The yard she bragged about at every HOA meeting. The yard she claimed was the only compliant one on the block. Within minutes, her flower beds looked like a swamp. She screamed something about lawsuits and plumbing sabotage, as if I had somehow possessed her drill and forced her to bore into my line. I just stood there, arms crossed, waiting for the cavalry, because once city infrastructure is involved, it's no longer neighbor versus neighbor. It's Karen versus bureaucracy, and bureaucracy always wins in the end. When the city engineer's truck pulled up 20 minutes later, Karen tried to intercept him like a stage actor catching his cue. She waved her clipboard, dripping wet pages flapping in the breeze, declaring herself president of the HOA. He didn't even look at the paper. He looked at the hole, the water pressure, the markings on the curb, and then at me. "You called it in?" he asked. I nodded. He scribbled something on his tablet and radioed for backup. Karen started shrieking again, this time about how I had conspired to mislabel pipes so she'd drill into them. The engineer didn't blink. He marked the sidewalk with spray paint, snapped photos, and said flatly, "This is going to be expensive." Karen froze. "For him?" she demanded, jabbing her finger at me. He shook his head slowly, pointing instead at her dripping shoes. "For whoever decided to take a drill to municipal infrastructure. That's tampering with city property. Minimum fine is 50 grand. Could be more." The silence that followed was almost holy. Neighbors gasped like they were watching a soap opera reveal. Karen's jaw opened and closed like a broken gate. And me? I couldn't resist. "Well, at least your lawn's getting watered for free," I said. That was just the beginning. The city engineer didn't just stop at his initial assessment. He pulled out a clipboard, started sketching a crude diagram, and then flagged down 2 other trucks that rolled up with flashing yellow lights. Suddenly my quiet suburban street looked like a municipal worksite. Cones were dropped, barriers erected, and the sound of jackhammers echoed as they began exposing more of the underground lines to see what else Karen's stunt had compromised. The crowd of gawkers grew. Kids in pajamas, neighbors with lawn chairs, even a few people recording on their phones like they were about to sell the footage to the local news. Karen, dripping wet and red-faced, tried to command the stage. She insisted she had legal oversight of all utilities under HOA authority. The engineer raised one eyebrow and asked her if she had a state license for excavation. She blinked rapidly, sputtered, and waved her soggy clipboard again. By the time the police arrived, summoned by the engineer rather than me, Karen had gone into full performance mode. She told them I had rigged a dangerous system, that my pipe was an illegal addition siphoning from city lines, and that her citizen inspection was the only reason the hazard had been discovered. The officers didn't buy it. They stood ankle-deep in water, watching the engineers shake their heads and mark every valve, and finally one of them muttered that this was above their pay grade. Karen latched onto that line, crowing that they had confirmed my crime. I said nothing. I didn't have to. The engineer spoke instead, calmly explaining that the pipe she drilled was not an addition but the primary feed, properly documented and inspected, and that tampering with it was classified as interference with city infrastructure. The officer took one look at Karen's dripping drill still lying in the grass and jotted something in his notepad. The next escalation came in the form of paperwork. The engineer pulled out a thick binder from his truck and began writing citations. Karen tried to hover over his shoulder, but he warned her that interfering further could add charges. He read out loud the tally. Unauthorized excavation, reckless property damage, illegal tampering with municipal utility, and willful disruption of public works. Each one carried fines, and combined they were more than enough to make her knees buckle. She tried to argue that the HOA bylaws gave her authority, but when asked for proof, she produced only a stapled packet of neighborhood guidelines about paint colors and trash can placement. The officer chuckled audibly. I thought maybe she'd retreat at that point, but Karen doesn't know how to retreat. She shifted tactics, loudly declaring that the water flooding her yard was evidence of sabotage. She tried to get the officer to take a report against me, claiming I had broken my own line just to ruin her landscaping. The sheer absurdity of it almost made me laugh, but I kept my face straight. The officer asked her if she truly believed I had dug underground, installed a false pipe, connected it to the city's grid, and then waited years for the perfect moment to watch her drill into it. She nodded. Dead serious. The engineer scribbled again, this time muttering something about a mental fitness evaluation if she kept interfering. That evening, once the main valve was shut down and the geyser controlled, the city issued a boil water notice to half the block. Karen's little stunt had contaminated the line with dirt and debris, and until tests were complete, nobody in the neighborhood could drink from the tap. My phone blew up with texts and calls from furious neighbors who all knew exactly whose fault it was. Some were polite, asking if I'd file charges. Others were less polite, sending screenshots of group chats roasting Karen into ashes. By nightfall, the HOA Facebook page looked like a battlefield. Someone had uploaded slow-motion video of the water shooting skyward, paired with the caption Karen vs. Hydrant, Round 1. Hundreds of laughing emojis followed. The next day, an emergency HOA meeting was called in the community hall. Karen arrived first, clutching a change of clothes and a binder thicker than a law student. She tried to spin the disaster as proof that residents needed stricter oversight and that she should be given more power to inspect property. Her supporters, maybe 3 people, nodded nervously. The rest of the room simmered with anger. Parents with kids who couldn't bathe, elderly residents stuck boiling water for tea, landscapers who lost contracts because the irrigation was cut off. I sat quietly in the back, waiting. When the city engineer arrived midway through the meeting, every head turned. He didn't mince words. He laid out the damages, the fines, and the fact that Karen's actions had created a liability nightmare. He even mentioned the possibility of civil suits from neighbors whose property was affected. The room went silent. Karen stammered, tried to point at me again, but the engineer shut her down with a single line. Ma'am, we have video evidence, witnesses, and your tool still embedded in the pipe. There is no confusion about who is responsible. At that moment, something cracked. Karen's face contorted, and she began shouting about conspiracies. She claimed I had bribed the city, that the engineer was my cousin, that everyone was out to ruin her. The HOA president, who usually avoided conflict like the plague, finally stood up and told her to sit down or leave. She refused. Security was called, and she was escorted out, still shouting about sabotage and hidden pipelines. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. What followed was both predictable and surreal. News outlets picked up the story within days. A local channel aired footage of the fountain, edited with dramatic music. Headlines read, HOA leader finds herself into disaster, and neighborhood flooded by overzealous enforcer. Reporters knocked on my door asking for comment. I gave them a shrug and a single sentence. I warned her not to drill. That clip made it into the evening broadcast, and by the next morning, I had coworkers sending me laughing texts that they'd seen me on TV. Karen, meanwhile, doubled down. She called into the station claiming media bias, insisting the city engineer was incompetent. They aired her rant unedited, and the comments section tore her apart. But the most shocking twist came later that week when a certified letter arrived at my house. Inside was notice from my insurance provider, explaining that Karen had attempted to file a claim on my policy for damages to her property. She had actually tried to say my negligence had destroyed her lawn. The sheer audacity stunned me. I called the agent, explained the situation, and he laughed outright, promising her claim would be denied. He also suggested I prepare, because people like her often escalate with lawsuits when cornered. That night I sat on my porch, sipping coffee, watching the street where the pavement was still patched from the repairs. I knew this wasn't over. Karen didn't accept consequences. She transformed them into vendettas, and the fines hanging over her head were about to ignite something even bigger. The letter came 3 days later, hand-delivered by a courier who looked far too apologetic for someone just doing their job. It was thick, heavy, and embossed with the name of a local law firm that specialized in property dispute. I didn't even have to open it to know who was behind it. Karen had finally made her move. Inside was a lawsuit accusing me of negligence, reckless plumbing, and willful damage to her property value. She claimed that my illegally installed water system had burst, destroying her landscaping, destabilizing her foundation, and leaving her in emotional distress so severe she could barely fulfill her duties as HOA representative. It was written with such inflated drama that I laughed out loud halfway through. But laughing didn't change the fact that lawsuits aren't jokes. Even frivolous ones cost time and money. I called my insurance company again. My agent chuckled, promised their legal team would handle it, but advised me to keep meticulous records. Document everything, he said. Karen's the type to escalate when the facts aren't on her side. I took his advice seriously. Every interaction, every note from the city engineer, every HOA meeting transcript. I compiled it all into a folder. If she wanted a paper war, I'd bring an arsenal. The first hearing was surreal. Karen strutted into the courthouse wearing a bright red blazer, dragging a suitcase full of binders that slammed onto the defense table like weapons. She glared at me across the room as if I'd murdered her favorite cat. Her lawyer, a young man who looked fresh out of law school, adjusted his tie nervously while she whispered furiously in his ear. My side of the courtroom was calm. The city engineer sat behind me, subpoenaed as a witness, flipping through his own neat file of documents. My attorney leaned over and whispered, "This won't last long." Karen's opening argument was a masterpiece of unintentional comedy. She claimed she had reason to believe my pipe was illegal, that her inspection was justified, and that the resulting damage was entirely my fault for not maintaining infrastructure to HOA standards. The judge interrupted her twice, asking if she understood the difference between private property and city-owned utilities. She dodged both questions, pivoting to how her yard had been traumatized. By the time she pulled out photos of muddy flower beds and held them up like crime scene evidence, the courtroom was snickering. Even the stenographer had to pause once to cover a cough that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. When it was our turn, the engineer walked calmly to the stand, laid out the diagrams, and explained in precise terms how the system was designed, when it had last been inspected, and exactly how Karen's drill had compromised it. He showed photos of her tool still embedded in the pipe, time-stamped video from neighbors' phones, and the official citations already issued. The judge's expression hardened with each piece of evidence. By the end, Karen's lawyer looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. The lawsuit was dismissed in record time, but the judge didn't stop there. She sternly warned Karen that filing frivolous claims could result in penalties. Karen tried to protest, shouting that she had rights as a homeowner, But the gavel came down, silencing her mid-sentence. Outside the courthouse, she tried to spin the outcome to a local reporter, claiming the system was rigged and that she'd been silenced by corruption. The footage aired that evening, side by side with the judge's official ruling. Viewers weren't kind. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, but Karen thrives on escalation. The very next week, she filed complaints with half a dozen city departments, zoning, fire safety, even the environmental office, alleging that my property was a hub of illegal activity. Each inspector arrived reluctantly, clipboards in hand, apologizing before they even stepped inside. One fire marshal shook his head, muttering that he'd wasted gas on a wild goose chase. After their inspections turned up nothing, they warned me that this kind of harassment was a pattern. "We've seen her type before," one said. "They'll bury you in complaints until you snap." But I didn't snap. I documented. Every visit, every cleared report, every inspector's sigh of exasperation went into my growing archive. Neighbors started contributing too, sending me screenshots of Karen's late-night rants in HOA group chats where she accused me of bribery, corruption, even espionage. Yes, espionage. She claimed I was running some kind of covert water operation in collusion with the city. It would have been hilarious if it weren't so disruptive. The breaking point for the neighborhood came one Saturday morning when Karen staged her own inspection demonstration. She showed up in a reflective vest she must have bought online, waving a plastic hard hat, and began pounding stakes into the ground along my property line. She announced to anyone within earshot that she was remapping the utilities because the city had clearly gotten it wrong. Within 15 minutes, she had half the street blocked off with yellow caution tape. Parents couldn't back their cars out. Kids on bikes were turned away. One guy trying to head to work actually rolled down his window and shouted, "Karen, you're insane." She responded by threatening to fine him for trespassing in a restricted zone. That was the last straw. Neighbors called the city en masse. The engineer returned, this time accompanied by a supervisor. They arrived to find Karen directing traffic with a flashlight, sweat pouring down her face as she barked orders like a traffic cop. The supervisor calmly informed her that unauthorized interference with public property, again, would escalate her fines. Karen screamed that she was being targeted, that the entire block was conspiring to ruin her, and that she would take her case to the governor if necessary. The supervisor didn't argue. He just handed her another citation, this one stapled with a notice of escalating penalties. The fine total had now ballooned well past $50,000. That night, the HOA group chat exploded. Some wanted her removed from the board. Others wanted her sued directly for damages. A few sympathetic voices cautioned restraint, but they were drowned out by the overwhelming frustration of residents who'd been living under boil water notices, blocked driveways, and now yellow caution tape. A petition circulated within hours. By the next morning, nearly every homeowner had signed it. The demand was simple: remove Karen from HOA leadership permanently. When the petition was delivered at the next meeting, Karen tore it in half on stage and shouted that signatures were forged. But the HOA president, tired and visibly shaken, announced that a special vote would be held. The room erupted in applause. Karen's face went pale, then purple with rage. She stormed out before the meeting ended, slamming the door so hard the exit sign rattled. For a brief moment I thought that might calm things down. But Karen doesn't retreat. She reloads. And as I walked home that night, past the patch street where her drill had birthed a geyser, I had the uneasy feeling she was already plotting her next move. I woke up the following Monday to the sound of heavy machinery. At first I thought the city had returned for more repairs, but when I stepped onto the porch, what I saw made my stomach tighten. A rented backhoe sat on the curb in front of my property, its diesel engine chugging loudly. And behind the controls, wearing oversized safety goggles and a neon vest that hung to her knees, was none other than Karen. She had gone from cordless drills to full-on construction equipment. Neighbors poured out of their houses in disbelief. A few recorded on their phones. Karen, perched on the backhoe like a queen on a throne, shouted over the engine that she was finally fixing the illegal lines the city refused to address. She swung the bucket toward my yard with such reckless force that clumps of soil sprayed across the sidewalk. My jaw clenched, but I stayed calm. I dialed the police immediately, explaining that my neighbor was operating heavy machinery without a permit and about to dig into public utilities. The dispatcher sighed and promised units were already en route. Apparently, multiple calls had come in within minutes. By the time the first squad car screeched up, Karen had already torn a trench across the edge of my lawn. She leapt down from the cab, waving her arms and yelling at the officers that I was harboring stolen water. One officer raised his hands in disbelief, asking how she even obtained the machine. Karen proudly announced she'd rented it using HOA funds for community safety. That admission hung in the air like a bomb. You could feel the collective outrage ripple through the gathered crowd. Someone shouted, "You used our dues for this?" Another neighbor, an accountant by trade, yelled that he'd audit every cent of the HOA account. Karen ignored them, pointing at the trench and insisting it was evidence of corruption. The police didn't argue. They radioed for backup and cordoned off the area. When they asked Karen to produce permits for excavation, she held up her soggy HOA handbook like it was a badge. The officer pinched the bridge of his nose and muttered something about another one of these days. Within half an hour, the city engineer arrived again, this time with a police sergeant. They surveyed the damage, shook their heads, and declared the excavation illegal. Karen immediately launched into another rant about conspiracies, accusing the engineer of colluding with me to drain HOA funds. The sergeant cut her off with a warning. One more stunt like this and she'd face criminal charges. That should have been the end, but Karen thrives on humiliation like oxygen. Instead of retreating, she doubled down. 2 nights later, while most of the block was asleep, she staged a bizarre, evidence-gathering mission. Neighbors' security cameras caught her sneaking across my lawn with a flashlight and a set of plastic containers. She crouched by the patched section of pipe, scooped muddy water into the containers, and labeled them with handwritten tags like contaminated proof. When I confronted her the next morning, she shrieked that she was collecting samples for the EPA. I asked if she even knew what EPA stood for. She snapped, "Evidence of property abuse," and stormed off clutching her containers like sacred relics. The absurdity might have been laughable if it weren't so disruptive. The next week, I received a letter from yet another agency, the county health department, informing me of a complaint about hazardous runoff. An inspector showed up, looked at my perfectly ordinary yard, and sighed. "We've had 3 calls about you in the last month," he said. "All from the same person. Don't worry, we know what's going on." He checked a few drains, filled out paperwork, and left, but the message was clear. Karen was willing to burn down the entire bureaucratic system just to get at me. Meanwhile, the HOA finances became the neighborhood's newest scandal. After her slip about using funds to rent the backhoe, residents demanded an emergency audit. What they found was damning. Karen had spent thousands of dollars of HOA money on inspection tools, consulting fees, and even public relations, which turned out to be a stack of cheaply printed flyers accusing me of corruption. She had even reimbursed herself for the cost of her neon vest and plastic hard hat. Outrage spread like wildfire. The petition to remove her had already gained traction, but now residents wanted more. They wanted restitution. Lawsuits were whispered about. Even her allies were backing away, muttering excuses about not knowing it had gone this far. The HOA board scheduled the removal vote. The night of the meeting, the community hall was packed tighter than I'd ever seen it. Karen arrived late, storming in with a folder stuffed with papers and a small entourage of 2 diehard supporters. She took the podium without being asked, screaming about sabotage, conspiracies, and hidden networks of illegal pipe. Her voice cracked, her hands shook, but her rage was still sharp enough to cut. The president tried to calm her, but she shoved him aside, demanding that the vote be cancelled. When the ballots were passed out anyway, she snatched a stack and tried to rip them up. Security escorted her outside before she could finish. The vote was overwhelming, 92% in favor of her removal. By the end of the night, she was officially stripped of her HOA authority. Cheers erupted, neighbors hugged, and some even popped champagne in the parking lot. But even in that moment of victory, I felt uneasy. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat. She was the type to turn it into fuel. Sure enough, the retaliation began almost immediately. A week later, I woke to find my mailbox stuffed with anonymous flyers accusing me of fraud. The wording was clumsy, but the intent was clear. Karen had shifted her campaign from HOA meetings to guerrilla warfare. The flyers claimed I had bribed city officials, that I was running black market water operations, and that my property value was dragging the whole neighborhood down. Neighbors brought them to me, shaking their heads in disbelief. One even said, "She's gone off the rails, but she won't stop until someone makes her." The city finally stepped in harder. After the backhoe incident, they had already levied more fines, but now they began discussing criminal charges. Tampering with utilities, misuse of HOA funds, harassment of officials. It all added up. When an investigator came by to collect statements, I handed over my meticulously kept folder, now bulging with documents, photos, and testimony. He flipped through it, nodding slowly, and finally said, "This is enough for a case." That night, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, I knew the story wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the whole neighborhood, fed up with one person's tyranny. Karen had gone from wielding clipboards to wielding heavy machinery, from bylaws to lawsuits, and now she was teetering on the edge of criminal court. I could sense the climax approaching, and though I'd stayed calm, sarcastic, and patient through it all, I had no doubt. The final showdown with Karen was coming, and it would be bigger than anything she or I had faced yet. The morning the city finally moved on Karen, it wasn't sirens or flashing lights that signaled the beginning, it was silence. An unusual, heavy silence that settled across our cul-de-sac. By then, the entire neighborhood had been waiting for this moment like a season finale. Everyone knew the investigators had gathered enough evidence. Everyone knew the fines had ballooned. And everyone knew Karen, stripped of her HOA crown, was still clinging to the fantasy that she'd outtweet the system. I spotted the white municipal vans first. They pulled up in a convoy, followed by a police cruiser and an unmarked sedan. Men and women in reflective jackets stepped out, clipboards in hand, moving with the kind of calm efficiency that meant paperwork was already signed. One neighbor whispered, "It's happening," and within minutes porches filled with spectators. Karen emerged from her house wearing a bathrobe and slippers, hair unbrushed, clutching a stack of papers like talismans. She screamed before anyone spoke, "This is harassment. I have rights." The lead investigator raised a hand and read from an official document. She was being served notice of violation. Tampering with municipal infrastructure, fraudulent use of HOA funds, harassment of city employees, and reckless endangerment. Each line item carried fines and possible criminal penalties. The grand total of her financial liability? Over $50,000. The number landed like a thunderclap. Neighbors gasped. Karen staggered backward, clutching her papers to her chest, then roared that she wouldn't pay a dime. The police officer stepped forward, calm but firm. He explained that noncompliance would result in liens on her property and possible seizure of asset. Karen shrieked that this was communism. She tried to hand him her HOA handbook as a counterargument. He didn't take it. He simply folded his arms and waited. The investigator, unfazed, began taping bright orange notices to her front door and mailbox. Official violation, pending enforcement. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of nailing the 95 Theses to her castle wall. Karen's response was as dramatic as ever. She bolted back inside, slamming the door. For a few tense minutes, the neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Was she barricading herself? Was she calling a lawyer? Then the curtains twitched, and she reappeared outside clutching a megaphone. She bellowed about corruption, deep state conspiracies, and her plan to take the case all the way to Washington. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. The spectacle was equal parts pathetic and mesmerizing. Children sat on the curb eating cereal from bowls, watching like it was Saturday morning cartoons. I stayed quiet, leaning against my porch railing, sipping coffee. I'd played the long game, and now all I had to do was witness the inevitable. When Karen spotted me across the street, she raised the megaphone and screamed that I was the ringleader, the puppet master behind the city's plot. I raised my cup in a mock toast. The crowd chuckled. That only fueled her fury. She ran to her garage, rummaged around, and emerged with her drill, the same one that had started this entire saga. She held it aloft like Excalibur, declaring it evidence of sabotage. The police officer finally intervened. He confiscated the drill, bagged it, and added it to the growing pile of evidence. Karen shrieked as if he'd stolen her child. The investigator handed her a final notice, warning that further interference would trigger immediate arrest. For once, Karen fell silent. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for support, but even her last two allies shuffled away, avoiding her gaze. She was alone. The aftermath stretched over weeks, but the climax had already played out. Liens were placed on her property. Her accounts were frozen pending investigation. HOA leadership formally banned her from any future office. Neighbors who'd been silent out of fear now spoke openly, sharing stories of her petty fines, her threats, her bullying. She wasn't just an isolated tyrant anymore, she was a cautionary tale. Local news revisited the story with relish, airing montages of her water geyser, her backhoe stunt, her megaphone rant. She became a meme, dubbed Pipeline Karen, with hashtags trending briefly on social media. But what struck me most wasn't her downfall, it was the neighborhood's transformation. Freed from her shadow, people began to reclaim their lives. Barbecues reappeared in driveways. Kids played without fear of being fined for chalk drawings. The HOA, once a weapon in her hands, became a functional group again, focused on real issues like potholes and playground repairs. People smiled more. They lingered on porches. The tension that had gripped us for years lifted, replaced by a quiet camaraderie born of shared survival. Karen, however, couldn't accept exile. Even under crushing fines, she tried to claw back relevance. She mailed rambling letters to city officials, accusing them of treason. She slipped anonymous flyers under doors at midnight, scrawled with warnings about illegal water syndicates. But her power was gone. No one listened anymore. She was noise without consequence. Eventually, the house that had been her fortress went dark. Rumors spread she'd left to stay with relatives while her legal battles dragged on. For the first time in years, the street felt truly quiet. One evening, as I watered my garden, the same garden she once accused of being a camouflage for hidden pipes, I reflected on how absurdly far things had spiraled. From a single act of entitlement with a drill to a cascade of fines, lawsuits, and public spectacle, Karen had authored her own downfall. All I'd done was stay patient, keep records, and let her trip over her own arrogance. It was the longest game of chess I'd ever played, and in the end she'd checkmated herself. Neighbors often stopped me now to say thanks, though I reminded them I hadn't done anything extraordinary. Karen had simply exposed herself, one outrageous act at a time. Still, people appreciated that I hadn't folded under her pressure. One older neighbor patted my shoulder and said, "You didn't just beat her. You showed us how to outlast her." That stuck with me. Months later, I drove past City Hall and spotted Karen standing on the steps, holding a handmade sign accusing the water department of fraud. Passers-by ignored her. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. I considered stopping, maybe even offering her the lemonade I joked about at the very start. But I didn't. Some people can't be reasoned with. Some people can only be left to their own noise. Back home, the street was alive again. Kids rode bikes past my driveway, splashing through the faint stains where her geyser once erupted. Lawns were green, fences freshly painted, conversations warm. Karen had drilled into a water pipe thinking she'd uncover corruption, but all she'd done was unleash her own ruin. The city marked her with 50,000 in fines, but her true punishment was something deeper: irrelevance. And as I sat on my porch with another cup of coffee, watching the neighborhood breathe freely, I realized the strangest truth of all. In the end, I didn't defeat Karen. She defeated herself. All I had to do was watch her dig.